Well, everyone, it's time for us to go ahead and compare the M2 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro and see which specific MacBook is a better one for you. Now, I will definitely tell you there really isn't a situation where the M1 MacBook Pro is the best one in every single case. There really is only one thing I can even kind of mildly think of, but for every other person out there, I would probably recommend buying an M2 MacBook Air. It is the one that makes the most amount of sense in my opinion, but I will leave both these MacBooks linked down in the description. You can get them from there, and you can actually help support the channel at the same time. Now, starting off with the outside of both these MacBooks, obviously they are a little bit different, but they're kind of the same thing too. With the M1 MacBook Pro that came out in 2020, this design is pretty much timeless in my opinion. It is almost the same thing as the M2 MacBook Air, but they're a little bit different as well. Personally, I used the M1 MacBook Pro for quite a bit of time before switching over to my M2 MacBook, or actually my M1 Pro MacBook, and I think the M1 MacBook Pro is very good. From a design standpoint, I think it still feels very premium. The only thing that there's kind of difference between the two is that the M1 MacBook Pro does have a touch bar, but strictly looking on the outside, this thing has two USB Type-C ports, the Apple logo up top, and it comes in a very small, compact form factor. With the M2 MacBook Air, on the other hand, we do have a little bit of a different design. So some people know this, some people don't. It is actually now a thinned MacBook, so there's no tapered edges. It just strictly comes kind of more like an M1 Pro MacBook, where it kind of is like flat on top and the bottom, and the flat sides kind of. With the M2 MacBook Air, it's kind of the same thing. It's just much thinner. So it is a really thin MacBook, and it doesn't feel like a thick MacBook by any means. And it still feels thinner and almost lighter than the 13-inch MacBook Pro, which is really good, but it is in a little bit of a bigger screen size, which is really nice. But with the M2 MacBook Air, we do get that additional MagSafe charger. So this is where things get really interesting. For a lot of people out there, they may not even know this, but the M2 MacBook Air does now have an additional port, technically speaking, than the M1 MacBook Pro. Now, the reason why this is important is because some people may look at the M1 MacBook Pro and think it is a better MacBook in every single area, but that's not quite the case. And I think most people probably know it's not beating the M2 MacBook Air by any means. With the M2 MacBook Air, with that additional MagSafe port, it does have the opportunity of freeing up a port, which is nice, but for a lot of people, if you're docking up your MacBook, it's really probably not going to affect you too much, but it is kind of nice to have that additional MagSafe port. On the outside though, that kind of covers it up. We do also have like the feet that protrude on the bottom of the M2 MacBook Air. It's kind of funny, but it's also kind of cool, and I actually kind of prefer it a little bit more as well. So that kind of covers it up on the outside. Now, flipping these things open, there's obviously some differences and some similarity as well. So with the M1, MacBook Pro, we had a 13.3-inch Retina display, and honestly, it was a really good panel. You had True Tone on it, and it looked really good. Like, I didn't have too much to complain about. And personally, whenever I used that specific MacBook display, I thought it was perfectly fine. Could I, do I wish it was a little bit better? Realistically, the only things I think Apple could have done were probably to put promotion on it and then maybe reduce the amount of bezel on it. But other than that, I think that, design of that, panel still holds up, and I think it's going to hold up for the next 10 years. Like, it's a really good panel. With the M2 MacBook Air, this is now a little bit of a bigger 13.6-inch panel. So the reason why this is important is because you are now getting technically a better panel, or at least a bigger panel and a newer design on the M2 MacBook Air than the M1 MacBook Pro. So if you're looking at it from a sheer design standpoint, the M2 MacBook Air does look like a newer MacBook, and even though it has a notch, it really doesn't affect you in any way, and I actually do think it looks better and is a better design choice than something like the standard big bezel that we have on something like the M1 MacBook Pro. So I will say, from a design standpoint with the display, maybe you can make the case that the M1 MacBook Pro's display looks a little bit sharper and better, but the M2 MacBook Air I think is probably the better one that I think most people will probably end up picking up. Now on the bottom, we do have kind of similar keyboards, but we have different layouts. So the M2 MacBook Air has, the same type of keyboard for the most part as the M1 MacBook Pro, but the difference here is that the M1 MacBook Pro actually has a touch bar on that keyboard, where the M2 MacBook Air does not have a touch bar. So this is another thing that most people have to kind of remember. Do you like using that touch bar? If you prefer that touch bar, then it may make a little bit more sense to actually buy something like the M1 MacBook Pro, but I don't really know too many people who prefer the touch bar. I was kind of indifferent, I didn't really care for it, but I didn't really hate it either. If you're somebody who hates having this touch bar, then obviously go for the M2 MacBook Air, but if you don't care for it, then you can stick with something like the M1 MacBook Pro, and you can probably even get one for a little bit of a cheaper value too in the used market. Now moving on to the actual performance and everything within these MacBooks, I will definitely tell you from everything that I've heard, the M2 MacBook Air is probably the better performing MacBook than both of these. The M1 MacBook Pro, when I used it, it was perfectly fine and it was giving me great performance. It wasn't until I updated macOS versions that things kind of started getting a little bit weirder. But before that, this MacBook handled everything I threw at it, and whether it was heavy video editing a bunch of videos at one time, it really didn't kick on the fans too much. And I think it handled I had a good, experience with it up until probably the last 2 months of me using it, to be honest. With the M2 MacBook Air, this is supposed to be that plus some. This is supposed to be a much better performing machine than the M1 chipsets, which is really good to see. On paper, the M1 MacBook Pro had 8-core CPUs and 8-core GPU inside of it, and you can get up to 16 gigabytes of RAM on that specific MacBook. On the M2 MacBook Air, on the other hand, Apple has now given us the ability of having an 8-core CPU, but we do have an 8-core GPU on the base model of the M2 MacBook Air, but you can get up to a 10-core GPU if you so choose so. Now, I don't think a lot of people will probably end up caring about it, but if you do care about it, again, you can go and switch up to that 10-core GPU if you want to, but it is more expensive, so keep that in mind. But you have the ability of going up to 24 gigabytes of RAM versus the 16 on the M1 MacBook Pro. So from a pure performance standpoint, the highest end M1 MacBook Pro shouldn't necessarily be as fast or as performance heavy as the highest end M2 MacBook Air. Now, if you kind of configure them here and there, things can change up, but you do have a much more powerful machine, or a little bit more of a powerful machine from the M2 MacBook Air than the M1 MacBook Pro. So definitely keep that in mind. In terms of battery life, this is what kind of freaks me out. The M1 MacBook Pro, Apple states that it has 20 hours of battery life, where the M2 MacBook Air actually gives us 18 hours of battery life. So every test will kind of differ here and there, but the fact that Apple has even mentioned on their website that the M1 MacBook Pro should give us better battery life is actually pretty insane to me. I don't know if this has anything to do with the fans that are built in with the M1 MacBook Pro and the non-fan architecture on the M2 MacBook Air, but I will say that is very kind of concerning, and I'm curious to see what Apple's going to be kind of doing about this in the future for the most part. But typically their Air lineup had better battery life, in this case not so much. And I will say, on top of that, the best feature for the most part with the specific M2 MacBook Air, the best feature for the most part of the M1 MacBook Pro is the price tag. Apple is not selling this thing brand new anymore, which means these things are probably going to flood the used market like crazy. I've seen a lot of these types of MacBooks go for, much cheaper than they were supposed to be going for. And if you want to, you can buy a really good spec'd out M1 MacBook Pro if you were to say, spend the same amount of money on this specific MacBook as opposed to the, M2 MacBook Air. You could probably get a higher end and top tier M1 MacBook Pro spec'd out more so than a M2 MacBook Air. So it really depends on your use case, and it really just depends on what you want to do. Are you comfortable buying a used MacBook? If you're completely okay with that, then I would probably recommend going for an M1 MacBook Pro. If you can get one for a really, really good value, then it really doesn't make any sense to me why I wouldn't recommend buying that specific MacBook over the M2 MacBook Air. However, if you want to buy a MacBook that's going to last you for the longest amount of time and you want to go buy a brand new MacBook, you don't have really too many choices. You can go buy an M2 MacBook Air, but there's really not any other choice, in the, used market if you don't want to go in the used market. But even looking on eBay real quick, I'm seeing a lot of, 512 gigabyte, 8 gig of RAM M1 MacBook Pros for about $1,250, which is about the same price that the M2 MacBook Air base model for $256 is going for. So I would definitely say the M1 models, they're still really enticing, and I would recommend buying them. They're going to last for a very long amount of time too. But I think the M2 MacBook Air is probably the better one for a majority of people out there. So that kind of covers it up. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that'll mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.